Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we are so thrilled that you can be with us. Let me give you a little bit of a program note, and that is in about an hour, we'll be talking with Eric Eggers. He's been on the program with us before. Years ago, wrote a book called Fraud: How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Wrote that 2 years ago, and I want to ask him if anything he wrote about in the book that he predicted might happen in 2020 actually is unfolding right now. So we'll talk about that. And then we have Mark Yarbrough, who is the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. We'll be talking about his new book, Jonah, and also just about seminary education, because we kind of need to break it up. We all recognize that we're kind of waiting for the final shoe to drop, for the final electoral votes to move back and forth. And they have, by the way. There are a lot of questions now about Arizona, which I'll get to in just a minute. But in honor of Mark Yarbrough and DTS graduates, they've always jokingly said that individuals that graduate from Dallas Theological Seminary tend to oftentimes have sermons with lots of alliteration. So just in honor of that today, we'll talk about the fact that a lot of what we're going to talk about today starts with C: corruption, competence. Some of the things that we're going to talk about maybe were actually corruption. Individuals trying to manipulate the vote, people trying to pull off a coup, all sorts of things. Sometimes it's just lack of competence. And a good example of this, which I dug out just a few minutes ago, and I did not know this before, is that sometimes people don't mess up the vote totals because they are corrupt or because they want their person to win. They fail to actually hit save on their computer. You think I'm making this up? Right now in Wisconsin, Joe Biden leads, I believe, Donald Trump around numbers about 20,000 votes. That's 0.6%. Wisconsin has been one of those that's going to be challenged. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And so that's 20,000 votes, which is, just taking your breath away, because in some respects, that's how much Donald Trump won over, well, actually by less than that, over Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin. And so, when you look at this, that is the case. But it turns out that there was an election in Wisconsin a few years ago in which they lost 14,000 votes. How? Well, it turns out that the Waukesha County clerk forgot to click save on her computer. Okay? So some of these very interesting anecdotes that are starting to come in. One saying, you saw all these votes going for Joe Biden and none for Trump. Well, then they came back and said, well, yes, but it turns out that was a typo. They actually added an extra zero, which makes me want to say, how many other typos might be out there as well? And I think it really comes down to the question for the day. Do you trust these elections? I mean, really, do you trust this election? And I think there are a number of individuals, both left and right, Democrat and conservative, that are saying, I'm not so sure I feel so good about this election system we have here in America. So anyway, I'm just going to point out that sometimes when people say there is good case for fraud, no, in some cases, just good case for incompetence, a lack of good technology. We can get into the whole question about whether or not individuals that filled out their ballot with a Sharpie should be counted or not, especially when election officials handed them a Sharpie and then said later that those are invalidated. There are just all sorts of questions that are surfacing. And when the election is a landslide, which of course is what everybody was predicting, then you don't pay quite as much attention to voter fraud. You don't pay as much attention to voter inaccuracies, machine failures, and just lack of training on the part of poll watchers and all of the rest. But nevertheless, that I think illustrates kind of the theme that will run through this hour. And then, of course, we'll talk about whether or not some of that might have been intentional and how fraud, at least in the past, has been perpetrated and whether or not we see any evidence of that here in the future. But let's, if we can, go to a couple of pieces that we have posted. This one is, if nothing else, just a real good summary looking at the fact that the presidential race isn't over, though, of course, at the moment, Joe Biden has a much more direct path to victory. But nevertheless, there are still some real questions here about what has happened in the upper Midwest, and that would be Michigan and Wisconsin. And most importantly, Pennsylvania. Whoever wrote this, I guess it was by the editors there, it said, the result in Pennsylvania, meanwhile, is as clear as glass of an old Lake Erie. Then a little bit later, it says some of the margins in some of these places are as thin as paper ballot. I mean, this is like writing for creative English class or something like that. But anyway, last check, Mr. Biden won Wisconsin supposedly by 20,000 votes. There will be a recount, and you can see why, because after all, if you can lose 14,000 votes because you failed to push the button that said save on your computer, might be some other things, might move the needle, might not. In Michigan, Mr. Biden's up by a lot more. That's 67,000 votes. But again, that's only 1.2 percentage points. So you have to recognize that some of these margins are still pretty small indeed. And this is one of the reasons why neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden want to talk about anything like concession, because they recognize that things are moving around pretty quickly. Team Trump insists, this article says, that Arizona will still flip to its column as outstanding ballots break for the president. Wouldn't be the first time a TV network has had to retract a call. No, that would not be the case. Mr. Trump pulls it off while holding Georgia and North Carolina, then winning Pennsylvania. He would then become the president. I think that's less likely, but, you don't want to say no when you just simply don't know. But that, I think, illustrates, again, kind of where we are. And my first article that we've posted here by Dan McLaughlin, Our Big, Messy, Diverse, Crazy Country Does It Again. And, of course, he points out that at this point we don't know a lot. But he says, if nothing else, there was, and this will bring us back to what we'll talk about after the break, a fairly unanimous pre-election consensus among the media, entertainment, and artistic elite who dominate American public discussion, and among the active social media users, that Donald Trump and the entire Republican Party were headed for a colossal defeat, repudiating the rule of a tiny, isolated minority of the population sure to be swamped in a high turnout election. It didn't happen. And so when we come back from the break, we'll talk about how, if anything, it went the other direction. For example, Donald Trump, since we're in Texas, primarily broadcasting today, got 1.2 million more votes in Texas than he did in 2016. What happened in Florida, in some respects, also illustrates the point in terms of picking up a very significant number of Hispanic votes. And then I also want to come back and talk about the attempt to try to completely bury the Senate leadership, and we'll talk about that, and the amount of money that was spent to try to do so, which actually did not work. And Victor Davis Hanson was on the other day to talk about that on Tucker Carlson, and maybe explained it for the first time. When you spend more than $100 million in a campaign to defeat Lindsey Graham, and there's not that much of a chance that you would defeat him, when you spend $90 million to try to defeat the Senate Majority Leader, even less likely that he would be defeated. What's going on? And I think Victor Davis Hanson had a very good argument for that, so we'll get to that after the break. And we'll talk about some of these other things that are now starting to fall into place in terms of what's in the House, what's in the Senate. And, of course, we'll continue to wait for who our next president will be. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many Americans probably never even heard of critical race theory until the Trump administration ordered the federal agencies to stop teaching programs based on it in the federal government. If you read articles about it, you might conclude that it is merely an anti-discrimination program, but the president went so far as to describe some of the government programs as toxic propaganda. Since there's so much confusion about critical race theory, I invited Dr. Doug Groothuis on my radio program to talk about his recent article on America, Critical Theory, and Social Crisis. He begins his article and his discussion on radio by talking briefly about American ideals as a standard to evaluate critical race theory. He points out that critical theory has its roots in cultural Marxism and is also tied to identity politics. You are defined by your group or intersection of groups called intersectionality. You are either in power or out of power. If you're in power, you are automatically discredited. If you are underprivileged, you are immune from criticism. That means the claims of critical race theory are unfalsifiable. It becomes impervious to counter evidence and thus cannot be rationally defended. He goes on to explain that the underprivileged can make demands, but they need not make arguments since the whole system, including basic rationality, is rigged against them. I think this explains why we hear proponents of critical race theory making statements without appealing to evidence and why they reject anyone trying to present evidence that might dispute their dogmatic statements. He concludes by taking us back to black civil rights heroes who instead appealed to the highest ideals of America and called for necessary changes in society. That is the model we should use as we work to right wrongs in society and work for racial reconciliation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Looks like we have another possibility of a recount. Some people are talking about that in Nevada, so we'll get to that later. But let me come back to the first article we've posted here today, in which, again, this was not the way it was predicted, and it really gets us back to some of these just outlandish predictions. I know some of you watch online, and if you do, from time to time, I think I will just hold up a various shot. Maybe I should create screenshots for this, but here's one where there was a prediction, interestingly enough, for a 17-point lead for Joe Biden over Donald Trump in Wisconsin. We just mentioned that a minute ago. Wisconsin, 20,000 votes, more, even less, 0.6% difference, and this was supposed to be a 17-point lead. It's hard to take that one seriously. But in just a minute, I also want to talk about the Senate, because there was, again, this prediction here. And I'm holding these up because some people say, oh, no, you are making that up. No, these are actual screenshots that I'm going to use time and time again. The final forecast, Democrats have a 3 in 4 chance of flipping the United States Senate. So, again, the idea that they would pick up actually 5, because one of those seats is going to go back to the Republicans, so they'd have to pick up 5 to get a net total of 4. That has not happened, and it is back to the point that I'm reading from here, because it's a very good summary by Dan McLaughlin, in which he said this was supposed to be a time when Trump would lose, the Senate would lose, there would be gains of Democrats in the House, and of course none of that so far has happened. As he says here, Republicans appear to have held control of the Senate. I think that's a foregone conclusion now, but okay, we'll leave it a little bit less confirmed there. Have gained seats in the House, yes, they have, and have won any of the seriously contested gubernatorial races. There were 13 governor's races and all of the rest. So, again, the point that Dan McLaughlin is making is that this all happened in an extremely high turnout environment, maybe the highest in over a century. As I mentioned, Donald Trump got an additional 1.2 million more votes in Texas than he did in 2016, burying the idea that Republican strength in that state is solely due to historically low voter turnout. He got 1 million more votes in Florida than last time. There was a blue wave, but there was also, as he says, a red wave to meet it. And Republican senators who were supposed to face close races against lavishly funded opponents instead won in blowouts, such as Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, John Cornyn in Texas, Steve Daines in Montana, Dan Sullivan in Alaska. As well, Johnny Ernst was able to get reelected, and it appears at the moment Tom Tillis is ahead in North Carolina. Susan Collins looks like indeed she will be, in fact, I think they've already called that one for her. David Perdue in Georgia, and of course we're waiting for one more out of Georgia that won't be decided simply because you had too many people running and nobody got the requisite 50%, but that one most likely will go to Kelly Loeffler, and that will then guarantee that except for those two switches for the Democrats in Arizona and Colorado, and then, of course, the one switch for Republican in Alabama, everything was pretty much status quo. Which brings me to a question that I sort of had in the back of my mind until I heard Victor Davis Hanson talk about this. Because if you look at the numbers, and I've got them in front of me here, the Democrats spent, the opponent to Mitch McConnell spent $90 million. That's a lot of money. You know, I do understand sometimes when you'll spend, I think didn't they spend about $80 million for Beto O'Rourke over Ted Cruz? But I think that one was an assumption that Ted Cruz was not popular. Beto O'Rourke was winning all sorts of people's enthusiasm. And so that money might have been seen as well spent. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. But when you're spending $90 million to defeat the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, what's the chances, really, if you just get into a room where people ask cost, benefit, and evaluation and history, why would you even think about spending $90 million to unseat a Senate Majority Leader? There's only one time in my lifetime where a Speaker of the House lost in an election, and that was out of the state of Washington, and it was a very unusual set of circumstances, Tom Foley, and on and on and on. We won't get into all that history now. But even more so, they spent $1.8 million to try to defeat Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, and then spent, $24 million to actually defeat John Cornyn in Texas. I have some other numbers here. Oh, another one is Susan Collins. They spent $69 million to try to defeat her in Maine. Well, all those people were reelected. Why would you spend $100 million on a race that didn't look like it even had the potential of being flipped? And I think Rick Davis Hanson came up with the answer. A lot of that money came from the big banks and the big donors, and it was a way of a shot across the bow, simply saying, if you don't go along with us in terms of some of these various Supreme Court nominees and federal nominees to the federal bench, we will bankrupt you. We will pour as much money as we can into a race to defeat you. And so I think that's really what was going on. Because if you think about that, Mitch McConnell, of course, Speaker of the House, Lindsey Graham, what's he? Well, of course, he is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary that will consider whether Joe Biden is elected or Donald Trump is reelected, all these various nominees for the courts. And then John Cornyn is essentially kind of second in command. And so you start and then Susan Collins was one of those that was being pressured as well. So you can see that there was maybe just an attempt to simply say, if you don't go along with what we want to accomplish, And that could be everything from trying to pack the Supreme Court, which I think is a dead issue now that you have Republicans controlling the Senate, as well as all sorts of nominees that might be really questionable. We're going to spend so much money that you will spend most of your waking hours thinking about what this might mean in your next re-election campaign. So anyway, I thought that maybe had some explanations to me when I was looking at that, saying it just doesn't even make sense. Even if you are convinced that some of these people are vulnerable, this is the kind of money that is off the charts. But again, back to my first article here, the Republican coalition, he said, came out of the woodwork, and it was neither the Mitt Romney coalition, full of well-heeled white suburbanites, nor the angry mass of rednecks that your Facebook friends see as the only possible Republican voter. Florida Hispanics, who have shunned Trump in 2016, while many voted for Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, backed the president this time in large numbers, shifted House seats in the Miami area, including ejecting the former Clinton cabinet secretary, Donna Shalala, from the House. That did not see that one coming at all. And early indicators show that the best Republican performance was actually among non-white voters in over half a century. So he goes on and talks about some other issues as well. There are objectively many reasons why Republicans should have been discouraged by Trump, why Democrats should have been uninspired by Biden, and why a pandemic should have suppressed the vote. But instead, what happened is new voters poured into the system from every direction, eager to make their voices heard and willing to line up behind these, I love this, two creaky old men. Trump will likely end with the most votes of any Republican in history and maybe the largest share of eligible voters of any Republican in decades. On the Democratic side, it may also be true of Joe Biden. So anyway, I just, before we have the election in our rear view mirror, thought I would mention a few of those numbers. We might get into it tomorrow because we have Jeremy Dice with us on our roundtable, but eventually we have to move ahead, but it's sometimes helpful to look behind and see what is happening. And so after the break, one of the other articles I've posted is what's been happening in the state of Arizona, because there were a number of people on Tuesday night that were very critical of the decision by Fox News and the Associated Press to call the race in Arizona for Joe Biden. The criticism came from the Trump campaign. The criticism even came from the governor of Arizona, and they pushed back, and now most people have put that in the question mark category, but we will see. The trend still looks like it goes towards Joe Biden, but I'm not going to make those predictions because even once they announce those particular votes, you then have almost instantaneously a request on one side or the other for a recount. So we'll see where that is. But nevertheless, the Trump campaign right now said that when all the votes are counted, they think Trump is going to win by 25,000 to 30,000 votes. I don't know where they're coming up with those numbers, but then again, they're looking at it every day, and we'll just see whether that's just a lot of optimism or whether or not there are going to be some interesting changes in the electoral map. We are going to keep waiting, and it's fine. So if you aren't patient, well, go try to do something else because it's going to take a while to figure all this out. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Eric Eggers will be with us in about a half an hour. We'll be talking about his book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. That came out a couple of years ago, and want to see if he's seen any evidence of that. And then we'll be talking with Mark Yarbrough, president of Dallas Theological Seminary. He has a new book out on Jonah, Beyond the Tale of a Whale, and kind of gets us away from some of the things that we're talking about right now. But one of the, I've seen some people saying, who are the winners, who are the losers? And obviously, I'll get to in just a minute, some of the losers are the people that actually predicted that this would be a landslide and was not. And that's one of the articles we've posted on the website. But one of the other losers, surprisingly, may be in the Democratic leadership. There has been a lot of rumblings about whether or not, especially from those who are much more progressive in the Democratic Party, whether they have been well served by Speaker Nancy Pelosi and even the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And a good illustration of that comes from this piece that came, again, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. And this one came out yesterday, but I thought I might read it because it reminds us as well that they said besides the media pollsters, which we'll get to in just a minute, the biggest immediate election losers on Tuesday were Democratic congressional leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Americans diminish Speaker Pelosi's House majority and appear to have kept Republicans in control of the Senate as a break on the left's agenda. Of course, I've already talked about that a little bit. Republicans lost seats in Colorado and Arizona, gained one in Alabama, and then it seems as if those others that were seen as vulnerable, Johnny Ernst in Iowa won, Susan Collins in Maine won, Steve Daines in Montana won, Tom Tillis in North Carolina looks like he's going to win, but they're still counting out there in North Carolina, so we'll leave it there. So they said Democrats literally poured hundreds of millions of dollars into races against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina and in Kentucky against Mitch McConnell. They both lost by double digits. Democrats seem to believe their own progressive pieties that money is destiny in politics. Even the losses for the Republicans maybe are considered a moral victory. I've heard some people say, well, what kind of moral victory you get when you lose? Well, that is the case, at least in the state of Michigan, because the challenger to the Democrat incumbent, Gary Peters, was the Iraqi war veteran, African-American John James, who actually outperformed Donald Trump and made the Michigan Senate race competitive for the first time in years. And, of course, you have some other situations like that that also could be considered somewhat moral victories. But what does this mean in terms of the Republican hold on the Senate? The editors put it this way. A Republican Senate would mean the end of the Biden-Bernie Sanders unity agenda. No death to the legislative filibuster, no new U.S. states, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, no Supreme Court packing, no confiscatory tax increases, no Green New Deal. If Mr. Biden wins, they said, and he wants to get something done, he'll have to go through Mitch the Knife, which I thought was kind of interesting. And on the other hand, Nancy Pelosi will keep her majority, but a much reduced one from what she used to have, 232 to 197. The Republicans slipped 2 seats in South Florida, just mentioned that a minute ago, amid of a surge of Hispanic turnout, and toppled a 15-year Republican representative, misspoke on that, Cullen Peterson in western Minnesota. Republicans also picked up a net 5 seats by Wednesday afternoon, could gain as many as 12 or 13. We're still counting some of those, so this really is much more surprising than anybody would have thought. And they regained seats they'd lost back in 2018 in Cedar Rapids, Charleston, and Oklahoma City. So a couple of really good things that have happened, and we've tried to pay attention to the Senate as well as the presidential election. I do want to talk about some of the polls, but I also want to take some phone calls. So if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head first to South Carolina, WLPE. David, thank you for joining us today. David, we got you on the line. Maybe I don't have David on the line. I will put David back on hold, and we'll see if we get David here in just a minute. David, do we got you this time? There we go. Now we got you.
Okay. My question is there a way that we can get in touch with people who did not vote and have them go to their voter registration place and see if somebody has voted in their name.
Very good point. Very good point. Because there are some ways to do that. Now, it's first of all, a person that did not vote is probably not going to have a lot of information or interest in doing so. But let me just use my example here in the state of Texas. I have been able to go and look at online, and it's very easy to find. It's in the elections committee for a group for my particular county. And I've gone down there and I've been able to check, that they did show that I voted, my wife voted, my daughter voted, that Kelly Shackelford voted, his wife voted. I mean, you can do that. And so if people were even so motivated to do so, that is a matter of public record. And what's, I think, so helpful is then you can go and not only see who voted in your place, but when they voted and who was in my case, I can even tell you who the election official was that checked my ID. And I had to scan my driver's license to do so. So in some respects, that can be done. The sad reality is not many people are going to be motivated to do so. But yes, that is something that people could do. And that's a real concern right now because it's amazing how many people that are deceased that have voted, and I've done whole commentaries on that. So, David, thank you for bringing that issue up.
Well, yeah, I checked my dad's record. He died in '94, and he's been off the record since '94. So that's good, at least.
Yes. So. Well, appreciate that. And, of course, as I've pointed out before, we have a couple of hundred counties in this country where there are more people registered to vote than there are people of voting age in those counties, which is because we are not working very hard to actually pull off people that have died, people that have moved. And, of course, the old joke I always say is no representation without respiration. I mean, indeed, dead people should not be allowed to vote. And that, unfortunately, has happened too often. And I have documented in one of my commentaries, even here in the state of Texas, there were some people that found that even in Dallas, there was somebody that had been voting, quote, since 1980, and the person had been deceased since 1980. So some of these things happen in ways that if you ever wanted to check it, you could. But again, the inclination for the average person who didn't want to go out and vote anyway to go and then check and see if somebody voted in their name is probably slim or none. But when you do check some of that, you find some pretty amazing things. David, thank you for bringing that up, and I appreciate you checking that for your father. Just before we take a break, one of the other articles I posted is by Adam Mill. Talks about the old sad. There are three kinds of lies, and, of course, statistics. You've heard it before. And he said, in an era in which more than 90% of voters committed to a decision weeks before the election, then when we're supposed to believe that Joe Biden was up 47% to 42% in Florida, he was up 6 points in North Carolina, 12 points in Michigan, 8 points in Wisconsin, although I showed you one where it was 17 points in Wisconsin. It's really hard to even take any of that seriously. And he points out that the argument that is always being made, and I went along with it for a while, was that some of these were the so-called shy Trump voters. And I love what he says. Trump voters don't really seem that shy, given the fact they've been involved in public parades and rallies and things like that. And what we have seen so often is that when the polls are further out, you see these incredible numbers. And then just as we get close to the election, we start hearing about the race is tightening. Well, if you've been around as long as I have, I've seen that every single time, and I don't think the race is tightening. I think finally the pollsters are recognizing that they're going to be shown up for saying wildly inaccurate things that couldn't possibly be true. And if nothing else, he ends this piece, which you can read in its entirety. Biden may still win the presidency. If he does, I wish him well and pray for his success. But regardless, we spent the last several months in a fog of coordinated propaganda posing as polling. We were told that Americans are about to elect Biden in a Reagan-style blue wave. Instead, as Tuesday became Wednesday, the race revealed itself to be what we probably always should have suspected: competitive and well within the reach of President Trump. So, if nothing else, you would hope that this would be the death knell of the polling industry, but I'm hate to say, I don't think that's going to be the case. We come back, I want to get into a couple of other issues. We've been talking about this idea of competence and corruption. And I want to talk about competence because in just a few minutes we'll be talking with Eric Eggers about corruption or possible corruption. And some of the problems we have right now, it shows up in the polls, it shows up in some of our elected officials, is just a lack of competence and really a lack of even understanding the people of America. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, one of the things that Michael Brown has done, he came up with a kind of 9 observations from the election. I won't get all 9 of them. I'll just pick out maybe half a dozen. But he's been on the program with us. And point number 1, once again, the polls got it wrong. Well, we spent some time talking about that for sure. Then number 2, there was no blue wave. Quite the contrary. Has a quote from Rachel Maddow. We don't quote her very often, but I thought it was pretty interesting. She said, "It's been remarkable to see the stability, not only between 2016 and 2020 in terms of the presidential map, but also the congressional races and Senate races up and down. On either side, you're not seeing not only no wave, because they're talking about the blue wave, but it's like a pond where you drop in a rock and there's no ripples. And so in some respects, things are a little more stable." Number 3, his point is, I think we would agree with that, there is a massive crisis of trust and even talks about the fact that the president has called the election a fraud. I wish the president would stop talking, but, he doesn't listen to me, so we'll leave it at that. And stop voting, all these things that just stop talking. Just, you're not helping what is going to be a long and difficult and already wrenching process anyway. And then goes on to talk about another one was the economy has been a bigger factor than the virus, which I had not picked up until I read some of this and some of the quotes, which maybe we'll get into as well. One of the others, people of faith should keep praying and putting their trust in God for his desired income. And I love the last one. God remains God. A friendly reminder that we have to trust in the sovereignty of God, and that is certainly the case. But I want to get into this issue of competence for just a minute, because the point I want to make is it's going to be even more important, no matter who's elected, and I suspect it's probably going to be Joe Biden, that you, if you're a listener, really need to have a lot more discernment than ever before, because the people that will be trying to influence you really don't know who you are. And I found probably the most powerful tweet on that came from David Brooks. David Brooks writes for the New York Times. He's the, quote, conservative columnist for the New York Times, and some days he is. But I love what he posted, and a lot of people have quoted this, because David Brooks said, our job in the media is to capture reality so that when reality voices itself, like last night, people aren't surprised. And he said, a pretty massive failure. We still are not good at capturing the rightward half of the country. And I want you to understand that the people that are going to be trying to influence you, those are the people in the news media. These are going to be the people in social media. These are going to be the people that are in entertainment. These are going to be individuals oftentimes that are elected officials, and they're certainly going to be your professors in the academy. They really don't understand you very much, and a good illustration of that is something I wrote about a number of years ago, in which Charles Murray, who's been on the program with us before, put together a 25-question quiz to assess how thick is your bubble. Because what we're starting to find out is that the people who are the elites, these are the leaders of the Democratic Party, oftentimes leaders in the Republican Party. These are the professors. These are the people in New York City and in Los Angeles that determine what you see, read, and hear in terms of news and entertainment. They live in an incredible bubble. Matter of fact, they found some of the bubbliest places in America were in Manhattan, especially the Upper East Side, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Hollywood. Okay, these are people that don't live in your world. And so let me just give you a couple of the questions and see how you would answer these questions. Question number one, have you ever walked on a factory floor? I worked in a machine shop, so I can say yes to that. I love this one. Who's Jimmy Johnson? If you're not a NASCAR fan, you go, and I've been with people that would go, I don't think I've even watched 1 minute of a NASCAR race. Why would anybody want to watch people just go round and round and round? Here's another question. Have you or your spouse ever purchased a pickup truck? Now, again, I've met a lot of people in New York City when I lived in Connecticut that not only had never ridden in a pickup truck, I've met a lot of people in New York City that have never driven a car. I'm not making this up. Never have driven a car. Next time I see Eric Metaxas is going to ask, do you even own a car? And when's the last time you drove a car? By the way, when's the last time Joe Biden drove a car? I'll guarantee it has to be at least 10 years, because when you're the vice president, you don't drive your car. Now, again, to be fair, when's the last time, Donald Trump's driven a car? No, but nevertheless, it's kind of interesting. Here's a couple more questions. Have you ever ridden on a Greyhound bus? It's amazing how many people you run into in these bubbliest areas never have ridden on a Greyhound bus. Listen to this was one of the questions. Have you ever had a close friend who was an evangelical Christian? Of course, everyone in the listening audience, I think if you're a Christian, probably I am. But that shows you how disconnected these individuals possibly are from the world of yours that actually are then going to tell you how to run your job, how to run your life. Just think about that for a minute. A couple more. Have you ever had a job that caused something to hurt at the end of the day? Yeah, I've been a ditch digger. I've been a janitor. Yeah, I can relate to that. Here's another one. What does the word Branson mean to you? That's Branson, Missouri, for those of you that have never been to Branson and don't even know what that is. And again, the point I'm making is that these are individuals that oftentimes are in the position of making decisions about you. They're making decisions about what kind of programs you would like to see. They're making decisions about what kind of policies we're going to implement. They're making decisions about what we will allow you to do or not do. They're making decisions about the safety regulations for your particular area of employment, and they've never been there. I've oftentimes wanted to ask somebody to do a survey, for example, of the Department of Agriculture and find how many of the individuals working in the Department of Agriculture have ever worked on a farm. It's a fair question, isn't it? And you realize that you have people that they don't know. They've never been working at a dirty job. They've never even watched the movie or the TV show Dirty Jobs. I mean, and yet they're deciding every single day about what you see, read, and hear, what policies are going to be followed, and how they are going to make the world better for you. And many of them have a sincere desire to fundamentally transform the society, because after all, many of those individuals were hoping that if they could flip both the House and the Senate, and flip the Senate and then keep the House, that you would have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and Joe Biden in the Oval Office. And thus, then we would get rid of the filibuster. We would get rid of the Electoral College. We would add 2 more U.S. senators, or 2 more states, so you'd have 4 more U.S. senators, and all sorts of other things that would be changed, and that you'd maybe have 15 people on the Supreme Court. They wouldn't just be changing society a little bit. They would have changed our entire system of government. And that, I think, illustrates, again, the fact that many of these individuals live in a bubble and they really cannot relate to your world. And so recognize that you probably know a lot more about what is best for your life than some unelected bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., some elected official that serves in either the House or the Senate or even your state legislature, and certainly know a lot more about the world than some of the people that are determining what you're going to see on a news program, what you're going to see on a television program. And so, in some respects, the flip side of that also is important. You need to exercise perhaps more discernment than ever before. And don't assume that just because they put that on the screen, just because they pass that particular law, it's really good for you. You're going to have perhaps have more discernment than you've ever had, simply because of the sad set of circumstances that we find ourselves in right now, where various elite people are making very important decisions about you. One last one. There's only one individual on the Supreme Court right now that did not go to Harvard or Yale. That's Amy Coney Barrett. That should tell you something right there. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition here of Point of View. And as we continue to watch who will be the next president of the United States, I wanted to get into some issues. And in one way or to another, we can kind of put them into one of two categories, both starting with C: competence and corruption. Now, sometimes the issue is incompetence. And an example I love to use is one that came out of Wisconsin. Right now, it looks like Mr. Biden leads by about 20,000 votes in Wisconsin. They want to do a recount, and that is a very real possibility that things could change if for no other reason than you go back to a couple of elections. This goes back a couple election cycles. They had at one point in Wisconsin lost 14,000 votes. Well, how did that happen? Well, the county clerk actually forgot to click save on her computer. So sometimes the problems that we have surfaced are simply a problem of incompetence or mistakes. There was a real big issue the other day about all of a sudden all these votes showing up, and then later they said, well, it was probably a typo. They added an extra zero, and which makes me wonder, well, how many other typos are up there? So in some respects, we'll get into in the next hour maybe some other questions about the competence and whether or not you trust this election. But something we've talked about on this program before, and I've even made available my booklet on voter fraud, which we still have available to you on our website, pointofview.net, is 2 years ago we had Eric Eggers on here, and he wrote the book called Fraud: How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Well, okay, he had that book come out in 2018. Now it's 2020. And so I thought 2 years later, let's come back and look at this. And if you're not familiar, Eric is the research director at the Government Accountability Institute. That's Peter Schweitzer's investigative group. He's been involved in the research and some of the programs and various documentaries we've talked about: Clinton Cash, extortion, secret empires, and the rest. The documentary film The Creepy Line is another one we've mentioned. And if nothing else, Eric has really done a great deal of research. That's in his book that was published by Regnery and the forward by Peter Schweitzer. And Eric, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. It's great to be back.
Let me start with just kind of an open-ended question. You have written about in this very extensive book, and we have information about it in case people have never read it, in about 200 pages, all the different ways in which fraud can take place. Have you seen any evidence over the last, say, 48 hours that any of those techniques that you've talked about might have surfaced?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the sad answer is yes, right? So one of the main points that we make in the book is that voter fraud occurs when illegal people or non-eligible voters become registered to vote. That's one of the main ways in which ballots that shouldn't count do count. And so how does that happen? Well, the Supreme Court cited statistics that was done by the Pew Center in 2012 that found 1 in 8 voter registrations in this country, that's 24 million of them, are wrong or flawed or inaccurate in some way. So that right there sets the table for potential illegal ballots to be cast. When you combine that systemic vulnerability with what's happened in the COVID era, in which we've seen this massive increase in mail-in balloting, which is a form of voting which is proven to be the most susceptible to fraud, and you've got everyone in many states being mailed ballots, everyone that's registered. Well, when you've got people that are illegally or wrongly registered, you got registrations that are wrong, that means ballots are going to the wrong places. And so that's how I think you've seen, as we've seen, there's a case that's floating around on the internet now that you can check on the Michigan Secretary of State website of somebody that's been dead for some time, but requesting a ballot and then submitting the ballot early this year. Right? Now, that's one example, but that doesn't happen if that person's not still on the voter rolls long after they've died. Pennsylvania, now in the last 48 hours, you've been highly controversial. There's this argument about they'll accept ballots up until Friday, but according to the ruling of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, they've said that the ballots need to be postmarked by Election Day or absent a clear postmark that says it was cast after Election Day. That will also count it, opening up the possibility that ballots with no postmark can be counted up until Friday.
There you go.
So, I mean, those are examples of systemic vulnerabilities that we outline in the book, I think, potentially leading to outcomes that undermine election integrity in 2020.
And again, last hour I was just doing a show and somebody said, well, how can you check to see whether or not somebody who is deceased or whether they're still on the voter rolls? And that's one issue. The other is, how could you check to see if somebody voted if you did not vote? And I said, well, the people that are least likely to check on that are the people that didn't vote. But I remember something else that you talked about in your book. Since Florida was in the news until recently, it looks like, and that's been claimed for Donald Trump, but you identified just an incredible number of double votes in Florida, for example, just as one example. And that goes all the way back to 2016 election. But so you've got people that are deceased who are voting. No representation without respiration is my point. Number two, that people might, if they didn't vote, have somebody vote in their place. And then third, you've got people that could vote in two different places simultaneously. So that is something that would cause a fair number of listeners to say, I don't feel real good about the integrity we have of our elections.
Yeah, as a Floridian, and I live in Tallahassee, Florida, can we just pause for a moment and can we just take a bow as a state that we got it right this time? I mean, not in terms of the outcome, but just like no problems in Florida, right?
No hanging chads.
Yeah, it's someone else's turn, Pennsylvania, we're looking at you, to hold the bucket. And so, but Jeb Bush actually has said, look, we got caught off guard in 2000. We learned our lesson. We changed our laws to allow for ballots to be counted at a reasonable time and to start, have reasonable practices and security measures put in place. What you're talking about in terms of the double voting study, we did an analysis after the 2016 election. I'm sure we'll do another one after this election where we went out and got as many data rolls from states, the voter rolls, as possible and put them in a commercial database. And we actually did the work of cross-referencing all these registrations, cross-referencing all the rolls. And, yeah, we found over 2,000 instances of double voting in Florida in 2016, meaning over 2,000 people cast a ballot in the state of Florida and cast a second ballot in a different state because they happened to be registered in different states. Now, ideally, states would check with each other and talk with each other and eliminate these duplicate registrations themselves. But when you have states that allow same-day voter registration, which is a prevalent issue, when you have people that register to vote, close to the deadline and the states don't have time or just aren't inclined to do this verification with other states, verification with Social Security databases, verification with felon lists, things like that, right? That's how fraudulent registrations occur. And so if nothing else, I think hopefully the relative attention that this is getting this year may lead to, as it did in Florida, some changes in protocols and procedures that maybe increase the integrity of the election process, which, by the way, shouldn't be a partisan issue, right?
No, should not.
We should all want every legal vote to count and only legal votes to count.
Yes.
And I think the issue that's being raised by some of the people with, I think, the Trump campaign right now is just the idea of, hey, what's happening? The contest in Pennsylvania, the contest in Michigan, right? The contest in Nevada. Those are states whose track record, unfortunately, is sort of the opposite of that aspiration.
Yep. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue for just a few more minutes. I want you to know about Eric's book, in which, of course, he's talked about some of the history of voter fraud, non-citizen voting, and, of course, we've already alluded a little bit to fraud by mail, but who's behind all of this? Who's funding all these attempts to prevent voter ID and voter integrity? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many Americans probably never even heard of critical race theory until the Trump administration ordered the federal agencies to stop teaching programs based on it in the federal government. If you read articles about it, you might conclude that it is merely an anti-discrimination program, but the president went so far as to describe some of the government programs as toxic propaganda. Since there's so much confusion about critical race theory, I invited Dr. Doug Groothuis on my radio program to talk about his recent article on America, Critical Theory, and Social Crisis. He begins his article and his discussion on radio by talking briefly about American ideals as a standard to evaluate critical race theory. He points out that critical theory has its roots in cultural Marxism and is also tied to identity politics. You are defined by your group or intersection of groups called intersectionality. You are either in power or out of power. If you're in power, you are automatically discredited. If you are underprivileged, you are immune from criticism. That means the claims of critical race theory are unfalsifiable. It becomes impervious to counter evidence and thus cannot be rationally defended. He goes on to explain that the underprivileged can make demands, but they need not make arguments since the whole system, including basic rationality, is rigged against them. I think this explains why we hear proponents of critical race theory making statements without appealing to evidence and why they reject anyone trying to present evidence that might dispute their dogmatic statements. He concludes by taking us back to black civil rights heroes who instead appealed to the highest ideals of America and called for necessary changes in society. That is the model we should use as we work to right wrongs in society and work for racial reconciliation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation with Eric Eggers for a few more minutes, and I might just, as a program note, mention that Mark Yarbrough will be with us at the bottom of the hour, new president of Dallas Theological Seminary. We're going to be talking about his new book and kind of get off this idea, but we'll come back to the issue of fraud tomorrow when Hans von Spakovsky will be with us, so we'll cover some of this each day. But, Eric, I remember last time we had you on, some people might say, well, this is just anecdotal, and do we have any people that have been trying to clean up the voter rolls? And, of course, you have out of Ohio, a case went all the way to the Supreme Court. But I remember you telling the story about in New York City, the Department of Investigation decided, let's see how easy it is to actually perpetrate fraud. So they sent people out to cast ballots on behalf of, say, elderly citizens, felons, and people who had moved. And almost all of them were successful. Matter of fact, one of the few that they caught was only because somebody happened to know that that was the name of a felon that they actually had been working with. So in some respects, whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you've got to recognize that it's quite easy to perpetrate fraud if you want to do so. Fair?
Absolutely, and Kerby, I'm so impressed with your memory. That's because the story that you told that's in my book is one of my favorite stories to tell because it does underscore how those 24 million voter registration issues that we discussed, how easily exploitable they are. The New York City undercover investigators sent people in to try to cast a total of 63 ballots on behalf of, as you noted, people that were deceased, people that were illegal immigrants, people that were felons, people that had moved. And 61 of the 63 times they were successful, and it's actually even better than what you said. One of the only 2 times that they weren't successful, they were attempting to cast a ballot on behalf of a felon, and it was the felon's mother who was working in the polling place.
That's right, yeah.
So
that's the only way you got caught. Yes.
That's the only way they got caught. It's crazy.
Yeah,
and so, I think that, and I'm just sort of always a little shocked at this pushback, the idea that, voter fraud, there's no evidence, these baseless claims is the phrase. But when you've seen the few times people go and attempt to exploit these registrations, and we know that there are registration issues all over the country. There's been reports of hundreds of counties in this country with more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age. And I don't think it's a question about having a motivated political base, right? I mean, and also one of the things that we've seen with these riots and these looters throughout the country, and I'm not questioning their motivation, but what I do think it proves is that when properly motivated, people have proven to be willing to violate basic laws if they think that the cause is justified. So why do we think people are so willing to violate property law but not election law, which there's virtually no consequence for?
Yes.
So, so I think you start lining up all these pieces, and as I did in the book, and then how hard is it to come to the conclusion that election integrity could be undermined?
Well, let's see if I can get to what I guess was chapter 2 of your book, and that is who's behind all this? Because, I have to have a photo ID to go into any government building. I have to have a photo ID to cash checks and to rent things, and on and on and on. I can't get on an airplane without a photo ID. But there is an incredible attempt to prevent people from having a photo ID. There's an attempt to try to change all these laws. And it does seem to me, dare I even mention the name George Soros, because I guess on Fox News sometimes you can't say that name, but George Soros seems to be behind some of that. And that's what you found, isn't it?
It's absolutely what I found. I mean, 2016, you had this guy named Mark Elias. He's out there working on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign. He's also working on behalf of organizations that are funded by George Soros and his related entities. And they're suing at every level to stop the implementation of voter ID and suing to stop states' efforts to try to remove illegal or erroneous voters from voter rolls. And by the way, I'll just tell you, and so your listeners know, we have a role to play as part of the solution in this. And in some of the interviews I've done, I mentioned the idea that people remain registered to vote in more than one state. And I was actually speaking to a conservative radio host. He said, yeah, I'm registered to vote in more than one state. I'm still registered in New York when I moved from there. And I said, well, why haven't you notified the authorities? He goes, because it's none of their business. So the idea that we have to be active citizens to be able to help kind of maintain some of these things. But
right.
When states try to be active, they're stopped by groups that are funded by George Soros. And then, ironically and maybe unfortunately, George Soros funds organizations like Acorn, the organizations that went by the name Acorn, organizations that went by things called La Raza, that then go out and try to roust up as many voters as possible, regardless of the legality of their status, and funnel them through the vulnerabilities that the lawyers fight to make sure exist. You're right. It shouldn't be controversial that you have to show ID or something with a picture and a signature to register to vote. Yet that remains a big-time talking point for pushback.
And again, sometimes the argument is as well, these are Republicans trying to suppress the vote. And the examples I've used this year, Eric, have almost all been in the Democratic primaries. And so whether we are still trying to figure out how many people voted for Bernie Sanders in the Iowa caucus, or how many people voted in the 12th congressional district in New York, or the fact that the third largest city in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey, had to actually ask for a mulligan because there was so much fraud associated with that particular election that they actually moved a re-election, if you will, to November. And you had, in round numbers, about 500,000 ballots that were thrown out during the primaries. These were Democrats against other Democrats. You couldn't blame the Republicans on this. These were other Democrats accusing other Democrats of fraud. So when you've had that much take place in the primaries, I think it's a little naive to assume that none of that's taking place during the general election.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the other thing you want to add to that is this massive increase in absentee ballots, which have proven to be the most susceptible form of fraud. And you get, fraud happens when chaos and confusion reign. And, we remain, as I believe we've discussed, a third world country when it comes to election technology, right? While countries like Estonia are conducting some elections with elements of blockchain technology, we're over here, losing ballots in bundles and trying to track down and, like you said, hanging chads and all the different forms of voting that occur. So, it would be nice if no matter what happens in terms of the election outcome, the uncertainty and I think the unease nationally leads to a conversation about what are common sense and reasonable steps we can take to make sure that the rules are strict and the rules are certain, but the rules are fair. And that we're going to be consistently applied, because that's the other thing that I think raises concerns is when they try to change the rules once the election starts.
Oh, boy.
Based on circumstances in the ground. And unfortunately, we see lawyers do that all the time.
Yes. And again, I've wished I had the time and money to put together kind of a football analogy, to have a umpire or a referee in a football team where you got some noise and everything. It looks like there's some football players in the background and say, we've decided now in the third quarter here, we're going to change the rules. And if you kick a field goal, it's actually going to be worth 5 points instead of 3 points. And a touchdown is going to be worth 7 points, and have everybody booing and all that. And yet that's exactly what has happened out of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and a variety of other places, Michigan, and in a few cases the Supreme Court has decided to jump in, but in most cases have not. And if all the conflict and chaos we have right now isn't bad enough, changing the election rules in midstream makes no sense at all. So one of the reasons why I wanted to get you back on is because I found that the book was very helpful. Your content was very good. And if people are still interested in the book, we've got information about that. And most importantly, we also have a link to, of course, the website that you and Peter Schweitzer are a part of, because the Government Accountability Institute gives you a place where you can even report corruption. And if you're concerned about these issues, I would encourage you to go to that website as well. And we have that linked here on our website, pointofview.net. So, Eric, thank you for joining us again here on Point of View.
Hey, my pleasure, Kerby. Thanks a lot. Always a pleasure.
Let's take a break, and let me just mention real quickly that I've been making available this booklet on voter fraud, and it gives you just a few facts and figures. I'm going to completely redo it. Matter of fact, somebody did point out the other day that I didn't really have a lot of Bible verses in there. There's not really a Bible verse per se that says, you are to count votes accurately, but maybe I can put in a couple of verses here from the Proverbs about honest weights and measures and things of that nature. But nevertheless, it does kind of take you through some of those issues of voter fraud. So if you find yourself, well, I'm interested in Eric Egger's book, but it's a hardback book and kind of expensive, but I wouldn't mind getting a free booklet on voter fraud. We have that available on our website still, and what we've done is made it very easy. You can click on the banner there, and if you are interested in just getting a quick instant download, just put your name, address, or actually your name and email is all we need. But for some of you that say, well, I'd really like to get a printed copy, then click on the button that says receive in the mail, and then we'll need your name and address, and we would be glad to get it to you. And while we're in the midst of kind of trying to make some sense out of this whole issue of voter fraud, I thought you might like to get a copy of that booklet, which I'm going to completely update after this election. Let's take a break. We have Dr. Mark Yarbrough with us in studio as we talk about his new book, Jonah, new president of Dallas Theological Seminary. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I knew you would like this change of pace, and I am certainly looking forward to it as well. Dr. Mark Yarbrough with us, and he has just been installed as the 6th president of Dallas Theological Seminary. Last time we had him on in a different studio, we talked about how to read the Bible like a seminary professor, a practical and entertaining exploration of the world's most famous book, and that is just a wonderful and delightful book, but we're going to be talking about his new book in terms of Jonah, Beyond the Tale of a Whale. We have that information on our website and also information about Dallas Theological Seminary, dts.edu. He is not only, of course, the president at Dallas Theological Seminary, but also professor of Bible exposition, serves as an elder at Centerpoint Church in Mesquite, and it is just great to have you back in studio.
It is always an honor to be here with you.
Well, if we can, for a minute, let's talk about Dallas Theological Seminary, because I was pretty much assuming that you would be the next president, but nobody necessarily announced it until we had a banquet, which you were fortunate enough to have just before COVID shut everything down. That was very good for you. But talk about this, because you're in the midst of actually building a new chapel. There are all sorts of construction taking place. And for our listeners at Dallas Seminary, talk about what has been taking place there at that institution.
Well, I tell you what, the Lord is doing an awful lot. We are a product of the grace of God. And it's been exciting to see, even in the midst of COVID, how the Lord has been at work. And isn't that true? The Lord has a tendency to do some of his greatest work in the midst of the mess. So we've certainly seen that. We've made all of the normal COVID decisions, like a lot of educational institutions. We are being as safe as possible. We have a COVID committee, and we're putting on masks and plexiglass and all those kinds of things. We are running actually at about 90% in terms of our live courses. Mm-hmm. And the Lord has just been incredibly gracious. We had record enrollment this year. Individuals are wanting to be better equipped, to be anchored in God's Word. And obviously that is our mission, to equip godly servant leaders. And so it's just been an amazing thing to see God's people standing with us. Lots of encouragement. Obviously, again, we have been impacted just like everybody else, but it has been an amazing thing to see how God has been incredibly faithful through this COVID moment.
Yes. And again, I had a chance to get to see what was going on there, because I did chapel after you had done that, met your new chaplain, and just incredibly gifted individuals. And of course, you know that we have Daryl Bach on this program. We've had Sandra Gallan on about the new book on sanctified sexuality, and all sorts of great resources that come out of Dallas Theological Seminary. So let me encourage you to find out a little bit more. And just before we do that, there are a lot of people that have said, okay, I would love to study under these great professors at Dallas Theological Seminary, but the chances of me picking up my family and driving to Dallas and trying to find a job and actually then enrolling in these courses are kind of slim and none. But now, because of all the technology, they can actually study with some of the great professors, including you, because I've watched some of your videos as well, right there in their own home, can't they?
You betcha. We have a host of programs that are completely online, full master's programs. Mm-hmm. And we have students all over the country and all over the world. And the other interesting thing is that we've been offering even free courses online that are at a non-credit level. Right. But we have about 350,000 people taking free courses with us. And so we're just tickled. That's a good Texas word, right? We're just tickled to be part of what God is doing, and to see people getting equipped and anchored in His Word.
Yeah. Dr. Mark Yarbrough with us. And again, we have this new book out. It's published by B&H. We have information about it on the website, and it's on the book of Jonah. And let's get into it, because first of all, kind of a who's who of people that have endorsed the book, all sorts of graduates, of course, including the previous president, Mark Bailey, and Tony Evans, and Andy Stanley, and Chip Ingram, and Sandra Gallan, who I just mentioned, all sorts of other individuals, Joe Stoll. But you start off by really helping us understand that we sort of, in many cases, when we come to Jonah, have a Sunday school understanding. And in some respects, you want to take us a little deeper, in part because you say there's a lot of detail in the book of Jonah. Why is that detail there? Explain that, if you might.
Well, I'll tell you what, it is absolutely wonderful literature.
Yes.
And I think it's important for us to do that. We are virtually impoverished as it is in terms of interpreting the genres of Scripture, and so the types of literature. When you start talking about Hebrew narrative, it is beautiful. I tell people, an unashamed Hebrew narrative junkie. I mean, it is absolutely amazing when you get into the text to see the flow, how it is packaged together. It is absolutely wonderful literature. It is told as a story. It is meant to be acted out. There are puns, and obviously puns are so difficult to be able to communicate from one language to another. And so it's a rich book. Obviously, first and foremost, it is God's Word. We make no apology about that. That's the position, obviously, at Dallas Seminary, my personal position. It's a real book, but it is so wonderfully told. And if you get into the story itself, it will actually help you understand it better, to appreciate the literature and how the author chooses to communicate it.
And as you point out, sometimes the statements you get are no one should run away from God and we should be able to help other people. But there's a lot more to the story, and that's kind of the structure that you really want to take us through, because in some respects, you're dealing with an individual who, of course, is disobedient, but at the same time, you see some real parallels, for example, between him and those on the ship. And again, I'm assuming that everybody knows the story of Jonah by now, but it's quite possible that they don't. And so you start taking us through all sorts of very significant points, which are ultimately what you call growth indicators. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, you bet. I think that any biblical author has a message. Okay, so let's just start there. There is meaning in this presentation. I always use the phrase of, we always have to pay attention to what the author is doing with what the author is saying. Pay attention to what the author is doing with what the author is saying. In other words, the author is leading us on a journey.
Right.
And when you get into, in particular, Hebrew narrative, you have to pay attention to the details, because it is the author's way of bubbling up the message points that he wants to bring about. Now, in narrative in particular, what is emphasized is this use of irony. Now, we're familiar with that. I mean, it's a word that we use in everyday language, and something happens just the opposite of what we would expect, and we say, oh, isn't that ironic? But all throughout the book of Jonah, so to come back to what you just said, about even in chapter 1, so think of it this way. When you get into these characters that are presented in Jonah chapter 1 about these sailors that are not Jewish, and the irony is that they act and live out more like God would desire his people than this renegade prophet. And so irony is from the very beginning of the book to the very end of the book. And these growth indicators that I kind of surface along the way, I really don't believe they're mine. I believe that the author has used a lot of detail to say, hey, this is an important point. We need you to pay attention to it as you're the reader in the book.
And I love that, because there are 12 of those, and some people say, boy, the book of Jonah is pretty short, and you found 12 different growth principles there. But let me, just before we take a break, talk about the contrast between the Gentiles and Noah. I always love charts. I've often said it's not a good Kerby Anderson sermon or message without a chart. But again, the Gentiles, each sailor calls out to his God, whereas Jonah, he's actually asking Jonah to call out his God. The sailors attempt to save Jonah's life. Jonah's fleeing, trying to save his own life. The sailors fear the Lord. Jonah claims he fears the Lord, but we don't really see that. The sailors make a sacrifice, make vows to the Lord. Jonah, well, maybe he does, but we don't really see that in the narrative. So in some respects, these Gentile sailors are more biblical than the biblical character, right?
That is exactly right. And that's a confrontation, because remember, when you're studying the book of Jonah in particular, so he has left Israel, right? He has been sent into the heart of the Assyrian Empire. And what was going on back at home is that the people had an external facade that looked good, but their hearts were so far from God. They were just going through the motions. And when you study, and I'm not going to get on all the details here, but Jeroboam II was king over Israel at that time. And he was just an evil and wicked. He was very much in his namesake. And so what we see here is that everything looks good sometimes on the outside, but internally there's an issue.
Yes.
And as the book unfolds, we begin to see that it's the heart of Jonah that has a problem.
Yes.
And I mean, by the time it gets to chapter 4, which, by the way, chapter 4 is never covered in any children's church or Sunday school version. We don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we actually interpret the story, chapters 1 through 3. But it's an amazing thing to see.
We'll talk about that. And again, I love some of the comparison between chapter 1 and 2, the sailors and the prophet, Christ is at sea and the prayers and delivery and all that, and just some great things to pull together. When we come back, let me talk about that for just a minute. We'll get to chapter 4 because we don't know what to do because it's sort of like a temper tantrum. And what's going on there? And how does that fit in? And again, we encourage you to get a copy of the book. If for no other reason, then it may help you find some really deep and important principles in the book of Jonah. Now, of course, we teach it to our kids, but I think it's for an adult as well. Just the fact that you can find 12 key principles that you can apply to your life are a lot more than what we normally cover in just children's church. So we're going to come back and continue our conversation with Dr. Mark Yarbrough. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know also more about him and Dallas Theological Seminary, simply click on his picture there. And, of course, we have an opportunity for you to get a copy of the book. It's available in hardback and Kindle. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with me today, Dr. Mark Yarbrough, president of Dallas Theological Seminary, author of a number of books, including this one, Jonah, Beyond the Tale of a Whale. And a little bit later, we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. We have a lot to cover, certainly in that regard, but 12 different growth indicators. But we talked about chapter 1. Let's get into chapter 2 for just a minute, because there's this prayer by Jonah, but you just told me off air the idea that it really isn't his words. And so that's something that helps you understand this in the Hebrew. And as a professor of biblical exposition, help us out with that.
You betcha. It's a fascinating part of the story because in chapter 1, after he runs, he gets thrown overboard. We're all familiar with that part of the narrative. In chapter 2, after he is swallowed by the large fish, inside the fish, it says that he prays to the Lord his God. And it is a beautiful prayer. You ought to read it out loud sometime, and I encourage everybody to do that. It's beautiful. It is highly organized. The Hebrew ear, when they heard this, they understood it to be a particular psalm, a psalm of thanksgiving. In other words, it's packaged in a particular way, and they understood that. But it's interesting as you unfold this beautiful statement. I mean, it's very practical. I mean, he talks about seaweed wrapped around his head and he sinks down, and then the Lord provides a miraculous way of providing for his life, right? So he tells his story. But the keen ear, and I think the Hebrew picked up on this, they started hearing words that were familiar to them. And what we really begin to find out is that none of these words are Jonah's. What he does is that he begins to cite from the Psalms that he had memorized.
Right.
Now, I'll be honest, when I was in children's church, and I can remember seeing this on board, somehow Jonah in this giant fish was sitting up on a chair with a little lampstand on it, and he's, I mean, those are the pictures I have in my mind. But obviously, can you imagine this moment? So he is crying out to the Lord, and so he pulls from his Hebrew hymn book, which is the Psalms.
The Psalms.
And he packages and presents this beautiful story. But the irony of this is that at the end of chapter 2, right, it sounds so beautiful, and it really does. Again, when you read it out loud, you hear it, it's very contextual. He talks about, and he's going to worship the Lord again. And then chapter 2, verse 10 comes.
The pretender, you called it.
That's exactly right, the pretender. Because the irony in the narrative is that when the Lord hears his prayer, the Lord says to the fish, puke him up.
Yeah.
I mean, it is one of those words. It's a powerful Hebrew word. I joke at times when I'm teaching this that I say, how often do you get to do a word study on vomit? And so the Lord tells Jonah, the Lord tells the fish to vomit him up. Okay, to the Hebrew ear. Okay, here's what's going on. That word is used extensively in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, right? About what would happen to Israel, to them as a nation.
If they're disobedient.
If they are disobedient to the law, they would be vomited out of the land. And so the Hebrew ear, when they heard this story, they're like, I think that's not just a way to get Jonah out. Think of all the other ways that God has delivered people. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more. The chariot came down and picked up the great prophet. He could have just removed him, but he tells the fish, puke him up. There you go. And it's, I believe, a commentary by God on Jonah's prayer, because his prayer sounded pious, but his heart was so far from what God wanted.
Well said. Of course, that's where he came from.
That's right.
Now, of course, he makes his way to the Assyrians, Nineveh. What was that like? Because that is one of the reasons why when he's supposed to go this direction, he's 180 degrees going the other direction.
Well, it sure seems like it because, it's funny, early in chapter 1 when you start hearing go to Nineveh. Nineveh was the heart of the Assyrian Empire, and we probably know more about the Assyrian Empire externally from extra-biblical material than we do any of the other major dominant powers, maybe outside of something like Greece or Rome. But in terms of Old Testament, we know an awful lot about the Assyrian Empire. And so Nineveh at one time was the capital. We know that, according to chapter 3, there is a king that's identified, the king of Nineveh. We know the time frame, but we don't know exactly who this is. But what we do know about Nineveh is that they were a very violent people. And there's all sorts of things that were a great confrontation to the law of God. But their violence against other people, they were known for skinning captives and taking those skins and plastering them to the outside of the walls of Nineveh. So knowing that, when I read chapter 1, one of my things is I'm thinking about, well, no wonder Jonah doesn't want to go. I mean, he's afraid of what's going to happen to him in some dark Assyrian alley. And I understand that. But we begin to find out that as the story unfolds, he finally goes in chapter 3, right after being puked up by the fish. He goes, he preaches what God gives him. And after that occurs, miraculously, the people repent.
That's right.
Right? And so all seems well, and it's almost as if there would be a climax of the book that the prophet goes home rejoicing because the people of Nineveh have come to faith in the God of Israel, right?
Now we're in chapter 4, aren't we?
That's right.
That nobody knows what to do with, except you do.
Well, yeah, I do believe it just takes an observant eye to get in there, because it's almost as if in chapter 4, that's really the purpose of the book. And I believe that if we miss or skirt around chapter 4, we're missing what the purpose of the book is, because God is after Jonah's heart.
Yes.
And it is the climax of the book in that we get into this discussion at the very beginning of chapter 4. And when Jonah sees that they repent, he becomes furious. The
That's
word
right.
that is used there is that he becomes angry. He's angry at God because it's okay for Jonah to receive the grace of God, but he doesn't want others to receive the grace of God. So that's a powerful part of the book that we get in chapter 4, and it's there that it is unpacked for us that Jonah has a heart problem. It really wasn't what was going to happen to him in some dark Assyrian alley. It was he hated those Ninevites. It's a storyline that is just powerful for us today, because, here's the reality. If you're a grace recipient, you've got to be a grace giver.
That's right.
And so that's what we see as we move into chapter 4.
Let me just mention that at the very end, you have a wrap-up, and you have every one of these very successful growth indicators, 12 of them, and a postscript. So if somebody listening right now, and I know we have a lot of pastors listening and Bible fellowship leaders and small group leaders and Sunday school leaders, they wanted to teach the book of Jonah. That's you've got it set up so that they can make their way through this. They could actually read it together, or this could be something you could preach through. And 12 very important growth principles that you derive out of a relatively short Old Testament book.
Yeah, that's really what it's for. This is a tool and a resource for the church. I do use it in the classroom as we walk through, and we engage with the biblical text along the way. Certainly, you'll see that, and we'll dive in because I want to be able to show the reader some of the important Hebrew words that are used, but you don't have to know Hebrew to be able to work with it and appreciate it. But it really is a tool for the church. It is being picked up. It's always exciting to me to see how the Lord will take something and use it for His glory, and that's the goal in all of this. But my prayer is that people will see it more than just a tale of a whale, that will move beyond the nursery, will move beyond the flannel graph. How's that for dating myself?
That's sure.
We'll move beyond the flannel graph, and then we'll really understand how God is after the hearts of His people.
That is so good. Jonah, Beyond the Tale of a Whale. And again, I would encourage you to get a copy of the book. We've got one here. But most importantly, go to dts.edu. And so if somebody would like to get one of those free courses, because I believe you teach one of those as well.
I teach several of them. That's right.
And so those would be some ones where you could have a chance to hear from Mark Yarbrough, or if you'd like to contact him and to get some other ideas on how you could teach this in your Sunday school class or church, that would be the case. And I would encourage you to think serious about enrolling at Dallas Theological Seminary, getting biblical training, and it is always great to have you in studio. So thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to always be with you, Kerby. Appreciate who you are and what you do. Keep it up.
And we're looking forward to the next hour, getting into some more of those issues in the news. We'll get Mark Yarbrough back because we have a lot more we can cover with him. Let me also mention that if you really want to be able to read the Bible like a seminary professor, and you want to laugh out loud, this guy's a great jokester, you will enjoy that book as well. So there are a lot of great resources. We have those available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and talk about voter fraud, and don't forget, we're still making that booklet available. It's all available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time getting into some of the issues in the news. I hope that if nothing else, you appreciate it. Just a little bit of an interruption, because we don't want to talk about the election 24/7. And actually today we're going to spend a little bit of time looking back and looking at a few lessons we could learn from this to apply in the future. And we may do a little of that tomorrow in our weekend edition. We also have Hans von Spaskowski with us, because he's been with the Federal Elections Commission and is an individual that has certainly looked at the issue of election fraud, but also just a lot of this may not necessarily be corruption, although there's been a fair amount of that in the past, but also just incompetence. And so whether it's competence or corruption, we're going to kind of follow those along the way. We'll get into some of the things we've learned, sadly, about how inaccurate those polls were and a variety of others. But if you'd like to join us, that phone call is available to you, 1-800-351-1212. So let's head to South Carolina first. WAGP. Bruce, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you for taking my call.
What would I think you want to share a story with us? Go ahead.
Yes, I do. My wife is originally from the Philippines, and she became a citizen on the 3rd of September. And I'm grateful for that privilege.
Very good.
We immediately registered her to vote. That was like the first thing. And when we went to the voting registration office, they asked for no documentation. So obviously, she's Filipina, so you can see that she's not, a born American person.
Uh-huh.
So I kind of insisted that they look at the certificate. We had the original, and so they finally, okay, well, we'll put it in her file. We'll make a copy of it and put it in her file. So that tells me that people are going to this particular registration office, and they're not checking to see if they, in fact, do qualify to be citizens to vote.
That is a sad commentary, because, again, if they've got a driver's license, then they say, oh, I'm assuming you're a citizen. I'm not even going to check on that. And so that's why we have, as Eric Eggers points out in his book, and as we'll hear tomorrow from Hans von Spackowski, that there are all sorts of individuals that we know are not actually really eligible to vote, but nevertheless voted in this election.
I would like to know what percentage of the Democrats or the Republicans would be the ones that were being fraudulent in their voting. It would be interesting to note, if they pulled out all of those ballots that are fraudulent, which way they voted. It'd be interesting.
Well, if nothing else, welcome her to the American culture. And, of course, my wife and I have had a chance to travel to the Philippines, teaching with Word of Life down there, which is kind of south of Manila. And certainly just appreciate the Filipino so much. As a matter of fact, they so appreciate Americans there. I mean, it's amazing how many times they say, hey, Joe, because it's from the old G.I. Joe. And so one of the most gracious and welcoming countries that my wife and I have ever been to.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing that, and I think it underscores some of the concerns going forward. Can we solve all the problems today? No. Should we figure out a way to do that in the future? Yes. And I think it brings me back to chapter 2 in Eric Egger's book that dealt with this whole idea of fraud, because indeed, if you look at the money behind it, there seem to be a lot of individuals that don't want to just have individuals who are eligible to vote voting in these elections. They want to have as many as individuals as possible. And as he pointed out, we have hundreds of counties in America in which you have more people who are registered to vote than you have people of voting age in those counties. And then you have to recognize the people of voting age, not all of them are eligible, because after all, if you're here illegally, you're not eligible to vote. If you are a felon, you're not eligible to vote. You can go through that long list. And we have a lot of people that each particular election cycle vote when they're not eligible to vote. And so the question is, do we really want to clean up these voting records? And the answer seems to be on the part of certain individuals, no, we really don't, because then that gives us a chance to manipulate those in ways that we would obviously be very concerned about. So if you'd like to join us, that opens up a line at 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, if nothing else, that this piece that came from the Wall Street Journal says, of course, the presidential race isn't over. Now, although I think we have to honestly admit that Joe Biden has a more direct path to a victory than Donald Trump. But nevertheless, you have a lot of questions being raised. And I pointed out, in case you have not heard this, because I know people tune in and tune out all the time, that the margin of difference in Wisconsin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is about 20,000 votes, or that's 0.6%. And you might say, well, that also brings us to something we'll talk about soon in terms of how inaccurate the polls were. For those of you that watch online, I every once in a while post some things for you to see, and here you will see one of the things that I've posted right now, actually held up, and that is that the argument that was being made just less than a week ago is that Joe Biden had a lead of 17 points over Donald Trump in Wisconsin. So we went from 17 points difference in a poll to 0.6% in Wisconsin. And you can see that, first of all, the polls were wildly inaccurate. But more to the point, the key that I made a minute ago is this comes, again, from the editors of the Wall Street Journal, pointing out that in an election a couple of years ago, a county clerk basically lost 14,000 votes because the county clerk failed to click save on her computer. Well, that's 14,000 votes out of a basically 20,000 vote spread, and you can begin to see really quickly how that would change. And one of the articles I've posted is on the issue of Arizona. Right now, Team Trump claims that Arizona still could flip to the president, and there have been some that were very critical of the Associated Press and even Fox News for claiming that Biden won Arizona before all of the count came in. If indeed Donald Trump did take Arizona, I still think that's a difficult path, and he then wins Georgia, North Carolina, probably so, and Pennsylvania, then he would be the president. So that's more of a long shot, but it illustrates again how each one of these particular calls that were made by the TV audience and by some of those individuals looking at those numbers may have been premature. And of course, if nothing else, talking about Wisconsin for just a minute, look at the fact that there was a people, and I'll hold it up one more time for those of you that like to watch online, a 17-point lead supposedly that Joe Biden had over Donald Trump. And now the best estimates are the lead that Joe Biden has over Donald Trump is 0.6%. We'll come back and talk about what's going on also in Michigan, but if nothing else, it brings me to another point I'm going to make in just a few minutes, and that is, don't trust the polls. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many Americans probably never even heard of critical race theory until the Trump administration ordered the federal agencies to stop teaching programs based on it in the federal government. If you read articles about it, you might conclude that it is merely an anti-discrimination program, but the president went so far as to describe some of the government programs as toxic propaganda. Since there's so much confusion about critical race theory, I invited Dr. Doug Groteis on my radio program to talk about his recent article on America, Critical Theory, and Social Crisis. He begins his article and his discussion on radio by talking briefly about American ideals as a standard to evaluate critical race theory. He points out that critical theory has its roots in cultural Marxism and is also tied to identity politics. You are defined by your group or intersection of groups called intersectionality. You are either in power or out of power. If you're in power, you are automatically discredited. If you are underprivileged, you are immune from criticism. That means the claims of critical race theory are unfalsifiable. It becomes impervious to counter evidence and thus cannot be rationally defended. He goes on to explain that the underprivileged can make demands, but they need not make arguments since the whole system, including basic rationality, is rigged against them. I think this explains why we hear proponents of critical race theory making statements without appealing to evidence and why they reject anyone trying to present evidence that might dispute their dogmatic statements. He concludes by taking us back to black civil rights heroes who instead appealed to the highest ideals of America and called for necessary changes in society. That is the model we should use as we work to right wrongs in society and work for racial reconciliation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of the booklet, A Biblical View on Pornography, go to viewpoints.info/pornography. That's viewpoints.info/pornography.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Have a couple of things to talk about here in just a minute. Matter of fact, the first article on this unpredictable election. But let me first of all go to Georgia on the Good News Network. Wendy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, Kerby. Thanks for taking my call. So, during the lockdown, I received a ballot that was mailed to me from the courthouse here in the county that I'm in, which is Wilkinson. And I completed that and mailed that right on back. And I have I didn't go and vote in person because I already voted, and, it's illegal to vote twice. So I considered myself having voted. So last night I found out that my vote wasn't recorded, nor was it received. I reached out to the registrar by email, and they emailed me and asked me to give them a call. And I did that today, but I haven't been able to get in touch with anybody. So I've also found, just with talking to other people, not within my county, but they've, had the same problem. So it's just like, I don't know. So the vote wasn't counted, wasn't received. So, where does that leave me and a lot of other people that, didn't get their vote counted?
And again, it's one of the reasons why we've, in many cases, said vote in person, because it is possible that it could have been lost by the post office, which I think is a sad commentary on the post office. There have been some that have suggested that some of those got opened, and if they weren't the right vote, got thrown away. Again, some of that is incompetence, which gets back to the issue of competence. Some of it is maybe fraud, which gets back to the issue of corruption. So whether it's competence or corruption, we'll look at both of those C's today. But I'm really sad because we're watching Georgia right now. We think all of that's going to work out. But
yeah, we were one of the states that,
yes.
Well, actually, our office didn't close on time because they had some issues. So they extended the deadline by an hour, and that was a big issue, it seems. So I'm just, sad that my vote wasn't received and didn't get counted, and the election outcome is, not going, as we're used to it happening, but since COVID, I thought, well, I better go ahead and do it because there were no plans for the state to reopen at that time. So, regret not voting in person, but trusted the system. So,
well, again, you have a chance to vote for a U.S. Senator because that's a runoff that will happen January 5th. So please do that because that is going to be important. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute in terms of how Republicans have retained control of the Senate, how Republicans have picked up a few very important seats in the House, and then, of course, see what happens with the presidential race. So those are a couple of key issues that we will get into in just a minute. Let me pick out another call real quickly. Walt in Texas, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, here's what Trump ought to do. Declare martial law, have the military go in and count the ballots, have the military count the ballots from here on out after every election, have the military start making arrests since this is an ongoing coup that the Democrats have staged against the president. Start arresting the Democrats and charge them with treason and sedition. And then put them on trial.
Again, that's off the top. That is a little more extreme than I thought I was going to get here. But first of all, there is a phrase that has been attributed to Joseph Stalin. I doubt he said it, but it's not the people who vote, it's the people that count the votes. And they're one of the reasons why we don't need to have martial law. We don't need to arrest people, but we do need to have poll watchers. And if you've been paying attention, in a couple of these situations, the poll watchers have not been able to have access. And so that's one of the particular cases that has been brought up. But no, we don't need to declare martial law, but we do need to have people who are counting the votes to be accountable, and we need to have some recounts because there's a couple of very good examples of where maybe a recount might make a difference. But anyway, let's move on to some of the other issues because my first article here is one about just the unpredictable election that we've had. Dan McLaughlin put it this way: our big, messy, diverse, crazy country does it again. And the point he was making is that we have seen some things that really, again, cause us to want to encourage all of you here on the listening audience of Point of View to exercise some discernment, because he says there was almost fairly unanimous pre-election consensus among the media, the entertainment field, the artistic elite who dominate American political discussion, and among the social media users that Donald Trump and the entire Republican Party were headed for a colossal defeat, repudiating this situation and in some respects being completely swamped in a high turnout election. And as he points out, that did not happen. If you've not looked at the numbers, let me just mention those for a minute. We have seen something that is, again, a high turnout environment, which, as he points out, may be the highest in our century for sure. Donald Trump, for example, got 1.2 million more votes in Texas than he did in 2016, which, if nothing else, kind of ends this argument that the reason Republicans are strong in Texas is due to historic low voter turnout. Donald Trump also got 1 million more votes in Florida. And so, yes, there might have been a blue wave, but it was also hit by a red wave. And then there was this attempt to, if nothing else, do what they can to completely defeat the Republican senators. And you have that situation in which there were attempts to spend an enormous amount of money to defeat Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, John Cornyn in Texas, Steve Daines in Montana, Dan Sullivan in Alaska. And, of course, then you've had some others that still did pretty well. Johnny Ernst, right now, Tom Tillis is leading in North Carolina. Susan Collins won in Maine, David Perdue in Georgia. And that is something I thought I would address for just a minute, because I was puzzled until I heard last night Victor Davis Hanson address one of those important issues, because just look at the numbers. Democrats spent $90 million to try to defeat the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, $108 million to defeat Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, $69 million to try to defeat Susan Collins, $24 million to defeat John Cornyn. You take those arguments and you just say, really? I mean, that doesn't make sense if you think about it, because did Democrats really think they could unseat Mitch McConnell? Senate Majority Leader. Pretty unlikely. There was one time in the past in which you had the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, who was defeated, but that's really rare. Usually powerful individuals win re-election, and to spend $90 million to defeat him, $108 million to defeat Lindsey Graham, and I think, as Victor Davis Hanson pointed out, and I think it was a good argument, this was an attempt to just intimidate senators, to simply say, look, if indeed Joe Biden is the president, and he puts forth nominees to the Supreme Court, you just better go along, or we will come and spend millions and millions of dollars and just bankrupt you and your campaign. And so, again, are they free to do it? Yes, it's a free election. Now, should we have some kind of constraints on elections? I wish we did, but it's not going to happen. And the Supreme Court has always ruled that this is part of free speech, so it's not going to happen. But it helped me understand why to spend $108 million to defeat Senator Lindsey Graham. Why? Because he, especially now that Republicans have retained control of the Senate, is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And whoever is the president, whether it is the re-election of Donald Trump or the election of Joe Biden, have to make their way through the Senate Judiciary Committee. And so maybe that explains why they spend just an incredible amount of money, but it really was nothing more than just a show that we will bankrupt you if you don't go along with our desire to put our people in office. But at the same time, it's also, I think, powerfully illustrated by the fact that because Republicans are controlling the Senate, then some of the arguments that people have made that this will actually end the, if you will, Biden-Bernie Sanders unity agenda, that it will prevent the attempt to remove the legislative filibuster, will prevent trying to add 2 new U.S. states, Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, for assumed to be Democratic senators, that it would end the idea of Supreme Court packing, and maybe even end the possibility of the Green New Deal. And all of that, when we come back from the break, illustrates again why maybe you don't want to trust all the polls, because I'll hold this one up here. The estimates were just a few days ago that there's 3 out of 4 chances that the Democrats will flip the U.S. Senate. Well, it didn't happen. Maybe that'll get back to whether or not some of these polls were accurate. We'll talk about that right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. For those of you in Georgia, just be patient with us because people all over the country are going, wait a minute, you keep talking about this additional election, the senatorial election. Okay, those of you in Georgia know this, but we broadcast in 36 other states where people are going, what? How'd that happen? Well, it turns out that in this particular special election, you had a number of individuals, both Democrat and Republican, running all together. And so in that special election, you have the possibility that no one would get 50% of the vote. And that's exactly what has happened. Raphael Warnock got, I think, about 32% of the vote. Kelly Loeffler got 26%. Doug Collins got 20%. And you go all the way down. Now, the assumption is that now when you have just the two running, that Kelly Loeffler will probably get 50% of the vote because you won't be splitting it down the road, and that will take place. I've heard the election will take place January 5th, but some are reporting that will be scheduled, and maybe it will be scheduled earlier. Now, if indeed she does win, which I think is the reasonable assumption, then the question is, what does that mean in terms of the Senate? Well, it means that the Republicans have a greater control of the Senate, but some people have been saying, well, what if she loses? Could you get to a point where you have 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats? Now, let me just mention that you don't have 50 Democrats because you have some people like Bernie Sanders that don't claim to be a Democrat but caucus with them. If you did have a 50-50, and if you did have Joe Biden win, which is the likely possibility, then that 50-50 tie is to be broken, according to the Constitution, by the vice president, would be Kamala Harris. So it would suggest that indeed if they wanted to push things through the Senate, she would have to spend a fair amount of time there in the U.S. Senate trying to break 50-50 ties, assuming that people always vote along their party lines. So that's where that story about a 50-50 Senate and the possibility of the vice president, Mike Pence, or more likely, many people think Kamala Harris might actually be involved. I don't see that happening. But in this year of 2020, I'm going to stop making any predictions other than the fact that we certainly just need to pay attention to that. And that brings us back to how important it was for you to actually cast your vote. We heard just a minute ago, I think it was from Wendy, talking about voting and voting by mail. So let's, if we can, go to another caller from Georgia who decided to vote in person because of that. So, Marcella, thank you for calling us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, how are you?
I'm good. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Wonderful. It's a wonderful day. I've been hearing all them different things about mail-in and this, and I got a chance to vote in person, and I took it. And I voted early on the 24th.
Very good.
And on Saturday.
A lot safer.
And I told a
a lot safer, easier, everything. Go ahead.
Told a friend of mine, and I did not know that you could vote on the internet. He voted on the internet.
I doubt he did.
I didn't know you could. He told me he
I'm not
did.
sure about that.
Oh, well.
I think he's kidding you.
Oh, well.
Yeah. Well, again, and if we ever have to vote on the internet, that will be the end of the republic as we know it, because you could hack all sorts of things. But nevertheless, that brings us back to some of these very significant votes that are taking place. And just before I take another phone call, before I run out of time, I do want to mention something I talked about just before we took the break. Again, I held this up. Estimates that 3 out of every 4 possibilities, about a 75% chance that Democrats would take over the Senate. Well, they did not and will not, I don't think. But it brings us back to one of the other articles. I think this is my 3rd article on the website here by Adam Mill, in which he points out that this argument that these polls were affected by late changes or the polls were tightening. I like what he says. I think he says balderdash. I haven't heard that word in a long time. So, that's in this, in case you haven't seen the word balderdash in print for a while. But he says in an era where more than 90% of the voters said they were already committed to making a decision about the presidency, then for them to say that Biden was up 47% to 42% in Florida, which, by the way, went to Donald Trump, that he was up 6 points in North Carolina. Looks like that will probably go for Donald Trump. Up 12 points in Michigan, not necessarily. 8 points in Wisconsin, although I showed you one that said 17 points. That's 0.6%. Michigan, I think, is 1.2%. You can see that none of those were even close. And he says it's hard to know exactly when the polling process became contaminated. Were these shy voters who refused to talk to pollsters? He said, a lot of the Trump supporters don't look very shy to me in terms of their impromptu public parades and rallies and those kinds of things. And then he takes on something that I've been upset about for years, because you'll have these people that will say, well, the race is tightening. No, it's not. The race was pretty clear weeks ago, but the bottom line is that as we got closer to the actual vote, in order to save face, you started seeing some of these people saying, well, maybe it's tightening, as if all of a sudden all sorts of people are deciding who they're going to vote for, when most of the people certainly did decide. So he says the opinions have not changed that much just in a few days. So he takes on this whole idea that the race was tightening, and he says, really, there's just a lot of abuse. And he says a lot of this is that the polls were, we now know, lies. And if nothing else, the theme that's running through today's program is you really need to have some discernment. So he ends by simply saying this: Biden may yet win the presidency, and if he does, I wish him well and pray for his success. But regardless, we spent the last several months in a fog of coordinated propaganda posing as polling. We were told that Americans were about to elect Biden in a Reagan-style blue wave. Instead, as Tuesday became Wednesday, the race revealed itself to be what we always probably suspected it was: competitive and well within the reach of the president, really, of either candidate. And so I posted that one just to once again remind you that you just need to exercise a lot more discernment. When we come back from the break, I'll get into that in more detail. Let's go to KYCC in Texas. Robert, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, Kirby. Is there possibly a glimmer of hope that President Trump is not going to concede to all this voter fraud that's been discussed, and he will take it to the Supreme Court, and possibly a recount will happen within the country? Is there a cloud in the silver lining here, a silver lining in the clouds here, or what?
And there have been some people that have said that, even Newt Gingrich, who I think over-predicted the election of Donald Trump, said that he was going to get 320 electoral votes. That's not going to happen. But he also thinks that that's a possibility. He also thinks that some of these cases might end up on the Supreme Court. There's an attempt right now to get a recount in Wisconsin. I just read something recently that they were thinking it might be a recount in Nevada. Still counting votes there in Arizona, so I can't even predict anymore. If it goes to the Supreme Court, I already addressed that yesterday, because there have been some that have said, well, then Amy Coney Barrett should recuse herself. In other words, she should not rule on that case. And I gave you the piece yesterday from Jonathan Turley, who, again, I have to have great respect for an individual who is a liberal, would probably refer to himself as a progressive, but is a professor of law at George Washington University, who nevertheless says, to use our phrase here, balderdash, there's no reason to actually believe that Amy Coney Barrett should recuse herself from this decision, and so it may go to the Supreme Court. So, indeed, that is the case. The election success today was the one in Pennsylvania, simply allowing poll watchers to have access. And when you don't allow poll watchers to have access, you begin to wonder what exactly is taking place here. We have lots and lots of anecdotes. Some of those turned out, as I mentioned yesterday, not to be true, that no, we don't have more people voting in some of these states than we have registered voters and things like that. We had one where there was an influx of votes, and now they're saying that's due primarily to the fact that there was a typo. And I'm willing to say there probably could have been a typo, but okay, how many other typos are out there? And this is beginning to be, once again, the great embarrassment for the American people. We should actually be a perfect example of how to run a fair and free election. And yet, if nothing else, as I mentioned yesterday from Glenn Greenwald, who again would refer to himself as a liberal, This is an embarrassment, and we should do what we can to improve this in the future. Tomorrow, of course, we will have our weekend edition. Hans von Spakowski has been part of the Federal Elections Commission. He's with the Heritage Foundation. He's put together this database of voter fraud. And I not only want to talk about any evidence he sees of voter fraud, but most importantly, going forward, what can we and should we do to prevent these kinds of problems happening once again? Let's take a break, though. I've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention we are making available again this booklet on voter fraud if you'd like to get a copy of it. And I mentioned one of the stories with Eric Eggers that he thought was so good because I remembered it and I put it in the book. The other one we didn't get to, and I thought I'd just mention it because it just makes me smile. And again, it's sad because it illustrates again how voter fraud can take place. But James O'Keefe's been on the program with us before. He does Project Veritas. And a number of years ago, he got his assistants to go and see how easy it would be to get a ballot. And so because they were in the Washington, D.C. area, they went into the precinct where then Attorney General Eric Holder was, and so walked in to say that I'm Eric Holder, and the individual said, okay, marked Eric Holder, and was ready to hand him a ballot. Okay, put this in perspective. Eric Holder at the time, 61 years of age, African-American, Attorney General for Barack Obama. This is a 20-year-old white kid they were ready to hand a ballot to because he said he was Eric Holder. Now, he didn't take it because that would have been voter fraud, but it illustrates only so well how when you don't have voter ID, that you could literally hand a ballot to someone claiming to be the African-American Attorney General of the United States, which shows that a lot of people working in that polling place didn't even know who the Attorney General was, to a white kid who's 20 years of age. Oh, America's got to do better than this. Just before we run out of time, let me mention that Michael Brown has done a very good piece in which he has about 9 points that he's made about election results, and I won't read all of them, but a couple of them. He said, once again, the polls got it wrong. Well, you think so, and he gives us some great illustrations there. Number 2, there was no blue wave, quite the contrary, which I thought was good. Number 3, which we've been talking about here, the massive crisis of trust. That is the case. Another one was the economy has been a bigger factor than the virus, which you wouldn't have necessarily predict. Also, Trump succeeded in increasing his black and Latino support. We do have some articles that get into that if you'd like to find those. But near the end, he has one on people of faith should keep praying, put their trust in God for his desired outcome, whatever that might be. And then the final one, God remains God. God's still in control. But I thought it was a good piece. But it brings me to my final closing comments, and that is the fact that we assume that everybody in these positions of authority are really competent, and more importantly, that they really understand who we are. And I think one of the most telling tweets that I've seen so far came from David Brooks. Now, David Brooks is the columnist for the New York Times. He's oftentimes referred to as the conservative, and some days I find myself agreeing with him, and some days I just roll my eyes. But he said something in a tweet that came out on Election Day that I thought was really good. And he said, our job in the media is to capture reality so that when reality voices itself, like last night, people aren't surprised. Pretty massive failure. We still aren't very good at capturing the rightward half of the country. And the point he's making is that, the people that are determining in the news what you see, read, and hear, the people that work in the entertainment field and determine what movies that you might see, what television programs you might see, the people that oftentimes are elected to political office, and certainly the professors in the academy, they really don't know you, and they really don't understand you. And a good way to illustrate this is I did this commentary a number of years ago, which was based on some research by Charles Murray, who's actually been on the program with us before. He wrote the book Coming Apart, and in which he argued that very high IQ, highly educated, upper-class individuals who were, in a sense, the leaders. These are the elite that determine in the media, in the academy, in the political realm, what you should do. His argument was they are very disconnected from mainstream America. And so he actually put together a quiz that first was available on PBS, and now it's in the book, and I've made some of it available, and found that a lot of these people live in a bubble. He found that some of the bubbliest zip codes were in New York, in the upper west side and the upper lower east sides of Manhattan. He also found them in some of the suburbs of New York, in California in particular, in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, and the Los Angeles region. And there's a number of zip codes even in Washington, D.C. And these are the people that determine what you read, what you see, what you hear. These are the people that write regulations for you, pass laws. They really don't even understand you. And if you've ever taken the test, it's fascinating. There's 25 questions. A couple of them are dated. One of them, have you ever been to an Applebee's? Okay, I don't think there's many Applebee's out there, but you could replace that with, I don't know, Denny's or something like that. But here are just a few of the questions on this. See whether you would answer yes or no to them or how you'd fill them out. Have you ever walked on a factory floor? Well, I worked in a machine shop, so I could say that. I love this one. Who's Jimmy Johnson? Most people go, NASCAR, never seen a minute of it. Don't even know who that is. Have you or your spouse ever purchased a pickup truck? I've met people in Connecticut and New York, never actually owned a car, never driven a car, never lived in a place where they've ever seen a pickup truck, never ridden in a pickup truck. I love this one. Have you ridden on a Greyhound bus? Yep, check that one there. Here it shows how disconnected these people are from Christians. One of the questions, have you ever had a close friend who was an evangelical Christian? I mean, again, the survey done by Lichter Rothman of the Media Elite found that people that are actually determining what you see on television, these people seldom and never attend religious services. They don't go to a church or synagogue. They don't know anybody that goes to a church or synagogue. Here's a few more. You ever had a job that caused something to hurt at the end of the day? Okay, I've worked as a janitor. I've dug ditches. I know that one. This one. What does the word Branson mean to you? Anyway, there's 25 questions in there. But again, the point I'm making is that these individuals who in some cases want you to elect them to public office, and they then are going to write laws and regulations that will affect your life, they don't live in your world. I've always wanted to see if we could find out how many people, for example, in the Department of Agriculture have ever worked on a farm. It'd be an interesting question to find out. And yet these are individuals that are your betters, and they oftentimes don't know what your world is like. Now, off air, we've had some people say, well, you could do that the other way. And how many people that are in the listening audience have ever been to the stock market, the floor of the stock exchange and things like that? I understand that. But the bottom line is, oftentimes, those of us that are Christians oftentimes know the secular world because we have to live in their world. Our kids go to the universities. We watch television programs. We see things in the Washington Post, the New York Times, but they don't know our world at all. And more importantly, I would suggest you conservatives know liberals a lot better than liberals know conservatives. And I'm not just saying that. The research done a couple of years ago by Jonathan Haidt proved that only so well. So these are the people that oftentimes are telling us that we are just about ready to see a blue wave, which didn't actually take place, that we were going to see a landslide for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That didn't take place. So the point I'm making is not to make fun of those individuals. Heavens no, they make fun of us. But to exercise a level of discernment. When you turn on a television program, when you listen to radio, even this program, when you go to an internet website, exercise some discernment. Because after all, some of those people that are telling you how to live your life, they really don't know anything about you. You probably know more about your life and how to run your life than they do. Unelected bureaucrats think they know what you need to do in terms of safety and everything else. But nevertheless, I think we need to come back and have a little more humility and a whole lot more discernment. Well, that's all we have for today. Let's take a break, and we will be back tomorrow for our Friday weekend edition. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.